Greetings everyone. Hello. Welcome. I think there's some friends among the crowd here, a lot of hugs going on. Hi Brenda. So welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. It is my pleasure to greet you on behalf of my colleagues at the Center and the Brooklyn Public Library and the library's Arts and Culture Department. BPL presents. Tonight we have three esteemed writers, each of whom has dedicated a good deal of time and passion to amplifying and lifting up Black history in the United States, a history that over the course of the country's almost 250 years has all too often been buried. Today, in alarming ways, these stories and histories are being whitewashed and buried again. Our guests will be talking about the threats we're witnessing now, what to make of these times, how to respond, and more. It's an honor to host this important conversation. I am so grateful to be partnering on this event with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, which celebrates the work of authors who promote dialogue, tolerance, and healing. All of our authors tonight have either been nominated for or presented that prize. I'll say it's a milestone anniversary for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, 20 years, so we're honored even more. A special thank you to Sarah Russo, with whom I worked very closely for many months to bring this conversation to fruition. Before I welcome our panel to the stage, I'm delighted to introduce Nicholas Rains, Executive Director of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation, to share a few words of greeting.
Hi there. My name is Nick Rains. I am privileged to be the Executive Director of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you all for being here this evening. Tonight we gather to talk about the erasure of Black history. Not a gentle fading away, but an intentional act, a theft, a silencing, a rewriting of who built this country and who paid the highest cost for its freedoms. Black history is not a side note of America's story. It is America's story. And yet in classrooms, in legislatures, in libraries, and in headlines, we see it distorted, banned, disintegrating before our eyes. Just yesterday, we witnessed something that should jolt us all. A man was gunned down. A man with a microphone was silenced by a bullet. That moment, as people who seek kindness and as people who seek peace, should send a chill down all of our spines. Because erasure doesn't always look like a law or a book ban. Sometimes it's violence that says your voice, your presence, your life isn't worth the very breath that you breathe. Whether we like it or not, it's a similar logic that has stifled Black voices for centuries. It's the very logic that led to the murder of George Floyd, that buried the Tulsa massacre under silence for 100 years. If we don't confront erasure, if we don't call it what it is, an assault on truth, a kind of cultural assassination, we will keep repeating it. So the question before us tonight is not simply how do we remember? The question is, do we have the courage to fight back against a system that kills and censors and rewrites? The Dayton Literary Peace Prize is the only award in the United States that recognizes authors who write on topics of peace. We provide a microphone to people who speak truths and write truths, and I'm proud to present them and bring them here to you tonight. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Following the moderated conversation, we're going to turn to your questions. Our ushers will bring the mic to you in your seat. Please just keep your questions as brief as possible so we can get as many in as we can. I also want to share that copies of the speakers' books are available at the CBH shop, which you walked by when you came in over there in that corner. I'm sure that our authors would be delighted to sign them after the program. Now it's my pleasure to tell you a bit about each of tonight's esteemed guests and then invite them to the stage. Victor Luckerson is a journalist and author who works to bring neglected Black history to light. His recent book on the history of Tulsa's Greenwood district, Built from the Fire, was named one of the 100 notable books of the year by the New York Times and received the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Victor is based in Washington, D.C., working as a national correspondent for Smithsonian Magazine. He also manages the email newsletter about underexplored aspects of Black history titled Run It Back. Robert Samuels is the award-winning author and journalist who co-wrote His Name is George Floyd, winner of the Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. It was also a finalist for the National Book Award. Robert's home base is at the Washington Post, where he writes in-depth stories about policy, people, and our evolving American identity. And tonight's moderator is Gilbert King, writer, producer, and host of the podcast Bone Valley, and the recent book by the same title about two men at the center of a Florida murder case and the justice system caught in between. King is the author of Devil in the Grove, the story of the Groveland Boys, and much more, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2013. So it is really an honor to host you all here. Thank you very much for bringing this conversation to the Center for Brooklyn History. Now, please help me welcome Victor Luckerson, Robert Samuels, and Gilbert King to the stage.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here at the Center for Brooklyn History along with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for this conversation, The Erasure of Black History. When I was researching and writing my book, Devil in the Grove, it's about Thurgood Marshall and the Groveland Boys, I saw firsthand how much Black history has been deliberately buried. Police files missing, stories silenced, families carrying memories that official records ignored. What gets remembered and what gets erased is not accidental. Together with our books and our authors here, we're going to explore not only their books, but also the broader question, how does America decide which histories endure and which are erased? So, Victor, I'm just going to start with you. Your book on Tulsa's Greenwood district pushes back against a long legacy of erasure following the 1921 massacre. How did you approach piecing together a history that many institutions tried to bury?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gilbert, and thank you to the Dayton Prize, the Brooklyn Library, the Brooklyn Center of History. And I really want to thank all y'all for being out here tonight. I feel like we're in a moment, really a year, I guess an era, where it's really easy to get overwhelmed and get a little numb to what's going on. But the fact y'all took the time to come out here tonight and engage on this is really, really important and valuable. So thank y'all so much for being here. I think, in terms of Greenwood's story, this whole project started for me actually involving, I think, erasure or the forgetting of this history. I was actually working as a technology and business reporter in Atlanta before working on this project, having lunch with a friend in 2017, and the film 12 Years a Slave came up, and my friend said he had not seen that movie, didn't want to see that movie, because he felt like so many of the depictions of Black history were all about brutal violence, Black folks being whipped as slaves before the Civil War, sick by dogs in the Civil Rights Movement. And I asked my friend, who himself is, or was, I guess, a young Black entrepreneur, I'm a little older now, but a young Black entrepreneur at the time, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street, example of us being successful? My friend had never heard of it. And so, the fact that this young Black entrepreneur had no conception of a Black Wall Street, really struck me at the time. And that's really kind of what initially motivated me to want to go visit Tulsa and sort of engage in this story. And so I ended up writing an article about Greenwood for the Ringer, where I used to work. And the very first time I went there actually was the anniversary of the race massacre in 2019. And I remember that I went, and it was the anniversary. I expected there to be a lot of honor and remembrance for this space, but at least at that time, we went to Greenwood on the anniversary of this horrific event. There were actually more people going to see minor league baseball in the neighborhood. There's a minor league baseball stadium in Greenwood. And so for me, I think initially seeing the erasure of Black Wall Street, the story of Black success that my friend did not know, but also the erasure of the Tulsa Race Massacre, this horrific event that Tulsa was ignoring, both in terms of memory, but also in terms of restitution, that's really kind of motivated me to want to engage in this work. And so that's really kind of what prompted me to engage in this story. So a few months after that, I ended up quitting my job at The Ringer. I made a Black country music playlist, and I packed up my life and moved out west to go live in Tulsa, Oklahoma for several years. So I worked on my project, which became Built from the Fire. So
I just want to follow up with something on that because one of my heroes is Brian Stevenson, and he says in order to write about injustice in America, you really have to be proximate. And you embedded yourself in Tulsa. You weren't just parachuting in. Can you just talk about what kind of a difference that made in your writing and your research?
yeah, I mean, I think it was really, really paramount to me. I mean, my first article about Greenwood was kind of a parachute journalism activity. You know, I went there for 3 or 4 days, wrote about it, and came back to Atlanta where I lived at the time. And I just sort of realized that there was no way to capture the full story. I think both mechanically, you can't really be around people enough and get access to the archives without being there day to day, but also I think spiritually, you know, you can't really, I think, absorb both the glory and the trauma of what happened there without breathing it in day to day. You know, for example, so for me, you know, my book deals with the race massacre very directly for 3 chapters. And I actually ended up writing those chapters out by hand in Greenwood. In this place called Standpipe Hill, there's this hill in the neighborhood that overlooks the city. So you can sort of both imagine what it would have been like when there were the barber shops and the doctors and the nightclubs and all that kind of stuff. But it's also the spot where the National Guard put a machine gun and fired down on the Greenwood at the time. And so for me to be able to like be in that space every day for a couple of months, like writing by hand those chapters, I don't think it would have come out the same way without being able to sort of channel that spirit like that.
It's really interesting. Robert, your book uses George Floyd's life story to illustrate the structures that shaped his experiences. How did you balance telling a deeply personal story with exposing systemic racism?
Thanks for the question. And I also want to co-sign everything Victor said about everyone who's here tonight. It takes an act of courage to be able to listen to truths and speak them in a time like we're living. When we thought about the life of George Floyd, my co-author Tilda Ronipa and I, we knew almost instinctively that it would be a disservice to him to talk about his life in a vacuum, because every inch of his life that we learned about had been rooted in these really deep, kind of messy historic structures. And the more we learned about them, the more we talked to super smart people who study things like land loss, the use of drug use, public health, housing, education. You know, they looked at George Floyd's aides and they said, you should probably ask their family about this. You should probably wonder about this. And in almost every instance, there was a strong connection. One of the prime examples had to do with this idea that George Floyd was a neighborhood nobody who had nothing coming along, this sort of presumption that because he looked like he did on the corner that day, that he was somehow a nefarious figure, if not a nefarious figure, a person who had no real connection to the greatness of American history. Now, when we first spoke to people in his family, they told us that actually it's not that. We come from a family who had always worked, right? In fact, our great-great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart, had 500 acres of land in North Carolina. He was one of the state's most prestigious Black farmers. And before he could pass along that wealth in a single generation, all of that was taken from him. Now, that's a place to start, right? But then when you start looking at the records, you realize that George Floyd's great-grandfather was not one of the most wealthy Black farmers in North Carolina. He was one of the wealthiest farmers in North Carolina, period, right? And then you look at these documents that show him forced to sign very confusing things, releasing the land, right? And they're incredibly confusing to him because we know he could not read because he was not allowed to do so, right? And then you look at the newspaper from that day when they're giving away the same land the same day he signs it, right? That's what the reporting showed in the book, right? And so when you think about not just what that does to wealth, but what that does to the psychology of someone living in America, what does it mean to your family when you hear that when you're wealthy, people take it. When you're wealthy, people will take it. What does that do to ambition, right? What does that mean for your relationship with the people who you work with and you work for, right? And so when you began to peel back the layers of George Floyd's story, not just to ennoble him, which we thought was important to make sure that people knew that he was a man of flesh and blood, more than a hashtag, more than a person whose name you should chant without knowing anything about, more than a person whose story you might be afraid of because of the way he looked. That his story was not simply his own. It was the story of so many Black Americans and connected to so many white Americans as well. The people who had enslaved George Floyd's family, the inheritors of that land, right? They went on to have prominent positions in government and in university systems. And George Floyd's family spent the rest of his life leading up to George Floyd working as sharecroppers, working in day-to-day jobs because of that distribution that happened hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about something with your research, and I'll just add this. From my experience, when I was working on this book, Devil in the Grove, it's kind of like a To Kill a Mockingbird type story where these 4 Black men in 1949 were falsely accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. It involved Thurgood Marshall, who came down for the defense, but it also involved a real racist sheriff who was taking it upon himself to execute the defendants. And when I started researching this in Florida, one of the things I found that was kind of alarming to me in a way was that white families I knew, they had families that were involved in the jury, they were also witnesses, and their children knew nothing about this case, nothing. And I could understand that. It was for the shame, I think, of just like, as the years go by, they realize it's a shameful thing to be associated with, and they don't really understand the whole story. But I was also curious that I found like a lot of the Black families I was talking to, families from the victims, they didn't know anything about this story either. Some of them told me they'd never seen a picture of their relative until I showed it to them. And I'm wondering what you guys think in your research, why that kind of erasure that's not institutional is happening on a more family basis. Why did you experience families not really understanding it or not even maybe wanting to talk about this?
That was definitely the case in the story of Greenwood. From the very first time I visited Greenwood to do my initial reporting, I met dozens of Black families in which this story had been buried. You know, they had mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and uncles who had experienced the destruction of Tulsa and Greenwood in 1921, but didn't talk about it later. And then there's a couple of reasons for that. I think one, and I realized just through my research, is, you know, in general in the United States, we have this sometimes false perception of linear progress as a country. And a lot of the Black folks who experienced Greenwood were also leaders of the civil rights movement in Tulsa. And so I think for some of those people, they hoped or expected that their children would never have to go through something like that in their own lifetimes. And so why should we bring up sort of old news if we're going to keep progressing as a country? I think as it sort of became obvious that America's history is much more cyclical than linear, it becomes more important to study and understand that kind of history for a lot of people. I think the other aspect of it, which is a little bit more personal, is just not wanting to pass that burden of trauma onto a younger person. I interviewed one family who were descendants of a really great newspaper editor named A.J. Smitherman. This man was sort of the leader of the anti-lynching crusades in Tulsa, ardently defending Greenwood. But during the race massacre, he was actually falsely indicted of inciting a riot and banished from the city forever as a fugitive, never to return. So his family moved to Buffalo. I found his family. I interviewed them. And one of his great-granddaughters said to me that, our inheritance should have been generational wealth. Instead, it was generational trauma. And so I think for the older generation, they did not want that to happen, and that would have been a really strong motivation to sort of keep this buried as much as they could have.
That came to you so easily because it took me months and months till I finally met a family. And it really is exactly what you just said. They didn't want to poison their children with this brand of racism and hatred. They just didn't want to burden them with it. But it took me a long time to figure that out. You just did.
Yeah, I mean, that so happens. I think for me personally, I'm from Alabama. My parents grew up in the Jim Crow South. And I feel like it was always referred to when I was growing up very glancingly. I hear these little insights about their lives, growing up in Alabama, but they didn't really want to lay it all on me. Yeah. And when I started digging into this book, I think a lot more honest conversations came out. So, for example, I found out when I was doing the project for this book, work on this book, that my parents were the first black family in my neighborhood where I grew up, and white families actually moved away in like the late 80s. And so there are sort of these stories that you don't want to, as black people, you don't necessarily want to sort of force the next generation to have to deal with. But I think often we find that actually we haven't escaped those dynamics, and so it becomes more important to understand what was going on in those earlier eras. So,
I think there's also something that's really interesting. The Floyd's family that I interviewed, they had this understanding of what had happened to their family that had been passed down. What the research that we had in the book showed was things were considerably worse than what had been passed down, which was pretty shocking because what was told to us seemed pretty terrible. I think there's another thing that's really important about the way stories are passed on, or the way it's super easy for a practice to become a custom, to become a tradition, right? So I grew up in the Bronx, right? And I never questioned why we never went to the hospital in our neighborhood, right? Never questioned why we just kind of presumed the care in our neighborhood would be worse than if we went to Lenox Hill as opposed to going to Our Lady of Mercy, right? And I think also people might not question why, if they had an uncle or someone with a drug issue, that why rehab didn't work out for them. It could have been the uncle was bad, right? But when you look into the research of how public health happens in this country, right? One of the really amazing things that we had found was that in the early 90s, the CDC puts out a study saying, we actually don't know anything about the psychology of black men, right? We don't know anything about why they do what they do, why they're taken to certain types of behaviors, and we need to know, right? And in that period, in the next 30 years, they could count 19 studies, only 19 studies in 30 years that even ventured to answer that question, right? And then we look at the idea that black people who are interested in researching black health, right, were half as likely to get research grants for their research than people who were researching health in general, which in this case would mean white health, right? And so when someone like George Floyd or someone like my uncle seeks treatment, right, are they getting treatment that's actually culturally in line with what they what they believe, what they know? And the answer was obvious. It was no in a lot of stances. George Floyd, a part of the reason he moved to Minneapolis was he found out about a great program that catered specifically to the health of black men. It was led by a man who was in rehab himself, and he was in a session, and someone had said, I was really upset because today my wife wouldn't give me $20 to go out and buy something, right? And the man said, well, in my community, it's not my wife won't give me the money, it's that there is no money, right? So how do you get to places like that? So I think a lot of times we put an unfair burden on communities who've had histories robbed from them. And because of that, they don't have the ability to be able to make some of the connections about some of the larger structural things. So there's something more than shame going on, right? There's a lack of access to information.
No, that's really interesting. I just want to follow up with something that just occurred to me, and I wonder if you consider this erasure of a different sort. But like, I think if you pay attention to Twitter, X, and like the far right influencers, when it comes to George Floyd, you're starting to see like this movement. I don't know if it's bot generated or actual influencers, but like, oh, that was not his cause of death. He died of drugs. He was a criminal, and there's a push for a pardon for George. What's his name? Derek Chauvin.
Yeah.
A pardon, like Trump might consider that as something that, and not to get political, but do you see that as a form of erasure and changing a narrative of what the George Floyd case was about?
Yes.
I didn't say I'd come without softballs.
But I think I think it's more than that, right? And rest in peace, Charlie Kirk. People would ask me about Charlie Kirk, who was one of the leaders of this theory all the time, and I would say, well, I wish Charlie Kirk were here today, and I really wish he would have read the book because, and I hate to say that because it sounds self-serving, but if he read it, this can sort of disabuse this theory, right? What is going on is that people have lifted up a temporary police autopsy that says, if we had found George Floyd in a room by himself, it would be reasonable to presume he had died of a drug overdose, right? Similarly, if you had found me dead in that room right there with nothing happen, it could be reasonable to think I died of the fact that I broke my arm 3 days ago. And bear in mind that report, which is temporary, also concludes it was a homicide, right? That the cause was asphyxiation. And also the medical examiner in the final determination testified in court, this is what happened, right? Now, if you look at the court testimony, you don't need to believe more than your eyes, but if you wanted to, you could believe the science, which showed that at least 91.5 pounds of weight was put on George Floyd's neck, right here, in between the back of in between the Adam's apple and the trachea, for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It also shows that Derek Chauvin, who had led the charge, did not follow the police protocol. He used a technique which is supposed to save people, right? It's supposed to save people. You're supposed to put the knee on the neck. We call that a prone restraint. Until the person stops resisting, and then you turn them on the side and you call the ambulance. In George Floyd's case, you see life leave the body. Derek Chauvin's knee remained on the neck after he stopped resisting, after there was no pulse, for more than 3 minutes after it showed that life has left the body. That's what the testimony shows, right? This idea is sort of based on junk logic, and it has happened, right, that occasionally someone will say something to me about this, and I will say exactly what I said to you. And then they will say, you should look at the report. I'd say, well, you should do 400 interviews and do all these things, and then you can talk to me about this. And then after like 4 going arounds, I realize I'm actually arguing with a bot, something that's AI generated. Like, I mean, sad but true, right? And I think what this experience has showed me in the larger sense, Gilbert, is that public narrative, right, and public memory can get shifted in an instant, right? I was at a college in Ohio a couple months ago. I asked a bunch of students, who knows what killed George Floyd? Half of them had no idea. Half of them thought it was debatable. right? So what we're seeing now is a real battle for public memory. And while it would be a real convenient thing to presume that this is to pardon Derek Chauvin, I spent some time chatting with Derek Chauvin's family as well, and we go into his history. Derek Chauvin, who, when we looked at his records, we found at least 8 other instances in which he had used that same technique, including one with a 17-year-old boy in which he did it for more than 20 minutes. Each time with increasing frequency, with increasing pressure, right? A part of it might be about pardoning Derek Chauvin, but I think a part of it is about recasting what made us so upset in 2020.
Yeah.
And I think that's abundantly clear. I think it's been eye-opening to me about this is kind of the way it works. And I think it really helped solidify my purpose in terms of being able to speak the truth and encouraging other people to get educated so they can help people who aren't foregone, who might be prone to said bots who are really sophisticated that I've met on Twitter.
Yeah.
X.
X, right. Yeah, and I just want to put that in context because this is a case that happened 5 years ago. It's on video. You can see the whole thing. And that narrative is trying to be changed. Imagine what it's like in the work that I do in the pre-civil rights movement where there's no cell phone cameras. Police are considered infallible when they get on the witness stand. The prosecutors will often say, do you think this man is going to risk his job over the life of a black man? And they don't use the word black in court even. But just imagine, like those don't show up in the lynching figures. But I see countless cases of police brutality, probably very similar, or they end with a gunshot. And the only testimony that you see in the medical coroner's report is that the police said, well, he was attempting escape or he was coming after me. And that's the end of the case. They don't go anywhere. There's no indictments. Nothing gets seen. Imagine how easy it is to change those narratives. So something that we see with our own eyes is even still being attempted to alter that narrative. Victor, we're seeing state legislatures restrict what can be taught in schools about race and history. How do you see this moment fitting into the longer pattern of erasure that both of you are documenting?
I think it goes back to what I said earlier about our nation's history being cyclical instead of linear. I think when I was younger, I was kind of on the linear train. I was 18 when President Obama was elected for the first time. Like I said, my parents grew up in the Jim Crow South. And so for me to have gone from having parents who grew up in a segregated world to being able to vote for the first black president made things feel very linear in my mind, But I think I've been very disavowed of that notion over the last 15 years or so. I think that one of the motivations for this erasure is to kind of keep that bucolic image of a linear progress of America intact for young people. I think an incident like the Tulsa race massacre really disrupts the idea that America progressed linearly from always getting closer to our ideals. One thing I've sort of started bringing up a lot of times when I talk to people these days is of the many executive orders President Trump has enacted this year, one of them targets K through 12 schools and says they have to do, quote, patriotic education or they risk being defunded. And they define patriotic education as saying that America has always been getting closer to its ideals throughout its history. But you cannot teach about Tulsa race massacre honestly and comply by that executive order, And so I think that there's really an effort to erase a lot of these things because if we can say that America has always been getting better day after day, week after week, year after year, that allows us to essentially forget what's happened. It's water on the bridge essentially. And that erases sort of hard questions about restorative justice, about reparations, and also about some of the current inequalities that exist. If America is always getting better, you have no right to complain. And so then that in many ways kind of motivates a lot of the politicians right now, both at the state and federal level, who are trying to hide so much of this history.
I've been following this in the news lately. The Pentagon recently removed Jackie Robinson and other DEI-related military pages. There's a personal one for me from where I grew up upstate New York. Henry Johnson was a World War I hero, Medal of Honor. just a fantastic, celebrated with his own parade through Harlem back during World War I. He had a military base named after him, and just recently it was changed back to, I don't think it was a Confederate general, but it was something like that. What's at stake when government refreshes this digital history like this, or realistic history?
Everything. And I don't mean that in a glib way, right? If we're unable to tell honest stories about who we are and what we've been, it's really hard to think about changing who we are and how we've been. You know, days before we met Gilbert, Tolu and I had learned about our first book ban, which happened in Memphis, Tennessee. And it happened in an all-black school district, at a school that was blocks away from where Tyree Nichols was beaten to death, right? With kids who are the same age as Dardella Frazier, who is the 16-year-old who had recorded George Floyd's death, and in retrospect, so bravely posted it on social media to contradict the police narrative that was also there. And what that experience, aside from it, being personally heartbreaking, told me, right, is that when there's the loom of action that can zap away funding from people, that can make lives harder for those who live, people start compromising, right? They start compromising themselves. And when they start compromising, they foreclose options to people who really need to learn that information, right? I don't know about you, Victor, but when Tolu and I had started writing the book, there's no one who I wanted to reach more than a 16-year-old black boy, right? And that's because I remember sort of the feeling of feeling like I'm outside of the box of American literature. Fine literature didn't look like me. And also just sort of not being able to have the language to express the things that I was seeing in my life that felt off, that felt strange, and not knowing why, right? That's what books can do, right? And that's what an honest conversation about books can do. And I think when we consider that, we often think about people like me who sort of were foreclosed of that option really early in life. However, I think it's also important that forecloses options for white people who want a better understanding of their country, who can similarly tell something's a little off, even if they're benefiting from it, right? And so I guess the question becomes why we're so skittish about complication, right? About what happens when we complicate a narrative with fact and with an understanding of empathy, with sympathy for other people. It dilutes our personhood. It helps disintegrate the fabric that, I think really makes America very special. I think the thing that I've always cherished was being around folks and understanding that in this vast space, we all call it home, but we all see home differently. And I think that's wonderful. And if we approached it with a sense of honesty, you can infuse that passion in everybody, right? But it's up to us to help people ensure that we're not afraid of it, right? We can do hard truths. And I think that's what's at stake. That's really what's at stake. What's at stake is if we live up to our ideals.
Robert, you talked about writing for a 16-year-old black boy. And I had a pretty unique experience with my book. I actually worked with a 16-year-old black boy, my teenage cousin, on my book. He's in Alabama, Stanley, and I actually hired him when he was 14. I remember I sort of explained everything about the book and how I wanted him to work with me as a researcher on my project. And then we went and had dinner with my aunt and uncle, his parents, and they were like, And Stanley's just 13 years old right now. Oh, I was like, I'm violating labor laws right now, having a 13-year-old, I don't know what I'm doing. But Stanley worked with me from age 14 through high school, basically, from 14 to 17, off and on, researching Greenwood and Tulsa race massacre. And it wasn't like kid stuff I gave. I gave him academic books to read about black soldiers during World War I. He analyzed massacre lawsuits that were filed by survivors of the event in the 1920s. He saw the pictures. And two things jump out to me. I had to talk to his mom about it initially, right? Do you want your son, who's 14 years old, to engage with this kind of material at this age? And she said, I do, because he's going to have to engage with it at some point, and better to come from you who's going to be responsible with it than somewhere out on the internet. The other thing I think that really stuck with me about that experience with Stanley is I ended up interviewing him about his experience when he was a senior in high school, when the book came out. And the big question I kind of had was, how did this change you, This was in 2023, so kind of when this entire book ban machine was kind of just getting going. And he said two things. One was that Stanley, I think, actually drew a lot of strength from the stories of Greenwood, of how these folks were able to, have their entire lives destroyed, but come back from that and build back an even better community. And the second thing was, it actually made him want to be a more engaged citizen, because he saw the dangers that can emerge in our society as Americans. He kind of had that idea of a linear progress, obliterated by this experience, and it made him actually care more about being an engaged citizen in our society. And so I think that dynamic, where you're getting young people engaged and caring about politics and engaging and helping their neighbor, is another reason that people, the powers that be, don't want that to be happening. So shout out to Stanley. He's at Princeton now, having a great time, but he's really a great person to work with on my project.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting, though, because, again, we're so afraid of guilt and shame, right? Everyone tells us it's going to make some people look guilty. They won't learn to love their country. That's not what your cousin experienced. Right. That's not what you experienced. That's not what you experienced. That's not what I experienced. And I think all of that's really telling, right? Exposition does not compromise the American ideal, right? It really helps it blossom.
It's interesting. I was listening to what you guys both said, and I feel like, I was kind of writing for a 16-year-old white kid, because I grew up in the suburbs, and I was ignorant to a lot of what was happening in America. The narrative that I'd been fed was very much whitewashed. We had this slavery problem, but then Abe Lincoln came along and fixed that, and then 100 years passed and had some other problems, but then Martin Luther King Jr. came along. And what happened to that 100 years in between there? There's a lot that's not in the history books. Sometimes you look at these photographs of the water fountains, the separate water fountains, white and colored. To me, when I was doing research, that didn't speak to what I was finding in my research. I wouldn't use, something that looked maybe rude and impolite. It was actually, what I was finding was brutality and terrorism. And we're not understanding this. I didn't know any of this stuff. And so I felt ashamed by that I didn't know this other side of American history that was just not being taught because it was really uncomfortable. And so that was sort of where I was writing. I think it comes together in the same place. But
how old are you, Gilbert?
Oh man,
I'm sorry. I'm saying this.
No, I'm 63.
Okay,
so.
but
Yeah.
I'm saying this only to make the point, right? That when the Floyds talk to us about sharecropping, right? In my mind, when I think about sharecropping, I thought about it in sort of sepia tones, it happened so long ago. And I had to say, wait a second, these people are living, right? They're living today, and they're not dying tomorrow. And I think one of the things is, what I'm hearing from what you're saying is we think about these things, when we look at these photographs, as if they happened so long ago. But you were talking about it as if it was so past history, but it was half a generation removed from you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the very last of those colored water fountain signs came down in this story. The sheriff refused to take them down until 1972, a court order from the Nixon administration. It was the last one. So it's not ancient history. This stuff is still living with us. Victor, what responsibilities do historians and authors carry when documenting these painful histories, especially when survivors or families are still living with the consequences?
One thing that was really important to me, and honestly, The murder of Charlie Kirk yesterday made me think about this and the fact that millions of people watched that man die online yesterday. I had to watch that, unfortunately. And we watched George Floyd die. We saw so many black people, black men die via video recordings over the last decade. And I think that exposure that sort of forced it upon people on the internet is a trauma that sort of gets passed down. And I think for me, at least, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't creating a work that would almost subconsciously like titillate the reader. You know, they're sort of getting this visceral reaction from the violence or the gore or that kind of thing. And so I was really careful with the way I presented things in the work, even in terms of the pictures, photos I used of the massacre itself and the victims, and making sure that I was describing things faithfully and accurately, but not excessively. So I think that was a really, really important aspect for me in terms of the responsibilities. In terms of sort of dealing with the folks directly, there are a couple of things. One was letting the people I was talking to guide the narrative and not going with preconceived notions about what it should be. So in Greenwood's case, for example, I mentioned that I really wanted this story to be about Black Wall Street, you know, the city upon a hill kind of thing, right? And what I found talking to people living there was, I actually interviewed this one man named Washington Rucker. He grew up in abject poverty in Greenwood in the 1940s. And he told me, oh, it was never Black Wall Street to me. I don't identify with that, you know? And so being able, I think, to tell a story about this place that actually feels real and authentic and lived in, where there is rich and poor, good and bad, all those dynamics, and also, I think, conversation among Black people about the best pathway forward, that was really, really important to me. It's to not just sort of be recreating mythologies that are just being perpetuated for one agenda, you know. So that was really valuable to me, to get that wider variety of perspectives to help you understand, and I think identify with the people there in a more human way, as opposed to them being symbols or superheroes.
Yeah. And Robert, I'm just curious because your book could have went in a lot of different directions. You made some choices along the way to incorporate history, and I'm just curious what you felt your responsibility was with a case like this that was on people's minds.
A few things. One, I thought so much about the people who carried it. Like the people who understood what it was like to grow up in the South, like George Floyd's family did. The people who understood, I remember, you know, in the book, there's a conversation with one of the former police chiefs in Minneapolis, Janae Harteau, and she says to me, you know, there are cops, you know, who are bad cops. And then there's this sort of the murky, they're the ones who, she said, they're the ones who put the handcuffs on a little too tight. You know, they're the ones who push it right there to the line. And you can't do anything about it. And I just thought about what that must mean to know that, right? To be the police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department and to know that you didn't have a Derek Chauvin, but you had multiple. And even if you tried, you couldn't do anything. You felt like you couldn't do enough. You know, we spent a lot of time, a lot of the reporting in the book's contemporaneous, meaning that when I was with people, we didn't know what would happen tomorrow. Like, we didn't know if Derek Chauvin was going to be acquitted. We didn't know if Derek Chauvin was going to be convicted. We didn't know if there was going to be book bans. We didn't know if Donald Trump was going to continue being president of the United States. We learned all of that in real time. And, you know, there are so many moments where I just kind of remember just sitting with someone who had known George Floyd, and they're not saying anything. They're kind of looking out the window or playing with a cat puzzle. And I thought, my God, you know, if people could understand what this is like on a level that's more than theoretical, to like understand kind of like the weight that happens when structural racism is placed upon you, I think that would be good work. Like, I think sort of like one of the things that I learned was there is this really important power that we had to be able to disperse the burdens of the people who are writing about, right? So they're not alone in the trenches, that when you tell this story, like, you don't do it just for them, but you do it because you help the reader to understand something that once felt so isolating and so devastating to somebody, right? And this is kind of, this is another thing I feel weird about saying, but our audiobook is read by a fantastic narrator named Dion Graham. And we had like a 20-minute conversation with Dion, and then he went, and 6 days later, he returned our work to us. And that's a strange feeling, to have what was once kind of your voice being articulated by someone else. And when Dion was finished reading the work, the first thing I thought of, like the first thing that came out of my mouth was, what a beautiful people. Like, my God, what a beautiful people, you know, that they are just kind of carrying all these things and they're going about their day and they still have the most stubborn optimism about what America can bring, even though they should have the least amount of optimism about what America can bring. And I thought, geez, if we could get people to understand that, that's also really good work. That the people who really should love this country the least, that their indefatigable spirit to make America true, like, because it's not true for them, but they're going to do it through their own work. I thought that's an amazing thing to let people know.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I just have one more question. I'll start with this, so it'll give you some time to think of something for this. But the question is, if you could choose one historical figure, event, or story that you wish were more universally known in American schools, not erased, what would it be and why? I'm going to start with a man that not a lot of people know about. His name is Harry T. Moore, and he was the executive secretary of the NAACP in Florida at the time that this case I wrote about. He brought more than 100,000 black voters onto the voting rolls, just changed the political landscape. He put a lot of pressure on white supremacists. He was very much involved with Thurgood Marshall in the school cases in Florida. And in the middle of this case from Devil in the Grove, while he was working with Thurgood Marshall, the Klan put a bomb under his house, killing both him and his wife on Christmas Eve of 1951. He was the first martyr of the modern civil rights movement. And there are monuments in Montgomery, Alabama, listing all the martyrs to the civil rights movement. He's not on there. And he's just completely forgotten, even in the state of Florida. And he was just a brilliant person who used to write these brilliant speeches and sermons, but that he was afraid to deliver. He would send his 12-year-old daughter to deliver them in churches, and she was magnificent, and I did get a chance to interview her. But if anyone asks me who needs to be known, it's Harry T. Moore. And so I'm just wondering if there's any event or any person from your research that you might say similarly.
I'd probably go back to the Tulsa story and wish that Mary Jones Parrish was known more. Mary Jones Parrish was a typing teacher in Greenwood in 1921. Her home was destroyed by the race massacre. She fled with her daughter. But before she fled, she started taking notes on what she was observing. As the massacre happened, her neighborhood was being burned down. After the neighborhood Greenwood was destroyed, she ended up interviewing about 24 other massacre survivors and published a book in 1923, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, about what had happened. This was a time in which the rewriting had already happened. You know, there had already been white newspaper articles saying that the old Negro town should never be rebuilt. It was these black vagrants' fault, you know. And her book actually was the first document from the black perspective about what had happened. And in any book you ever read about Greenwood or any movie you ever see, it's going to be based off what she found in that time period. And honestly, I thought about what she did in terms of also what you did, Robert, in terms of capturing contemporaneously what is going on. And so, you know, her book was ultimately ignored in its time. She only printed about 24 copies of it. But because she wrote it down, it persisted. And so I think it's so important to have history that not only looks 100 years back, but captures the moment for history too, which I think she did really well, and it made me think about what you guys did with the George Floyd book also.
This is a tough question for me because I tend not to work with major figures. I find them intimidating, and sometimes I convince myself they're boring. But I think, I always think about these small people who do these really incredible things in their community, right? Like the genius of the rehab director who saw George Floyd and was smart enough to ask him, what do you think of your body? You're 6'6", 225 pounds. What do you think of your body? Who is able to excavate the terror that he had of being him, just being him, right? Like, I think about every school teacher who chooses a book and does something really wonderful, and those are the people who I wish we just knew more about. I was at this really wonderful event a couple months ago in Birmingham, and I had learned in Dayton that two of the original freedom riders were still alive. Only two of the original ones. And I had always really been fascinated with them just because I thought that if I was alive during that period, that would probably be the choice that would have been asked of me. Would you ride a bus, right? And I'd like to think I'd say yes. And, when I was talking to them, I really wanted to know what they thought about, what you were saying, Victor, about American history being cyclical rather than linear, right? And I think both would agree that, it feels more cyclical now than linear. And I thought, how cruel must that be, right? To be at the end of your life, to have been beaten, to have things thrown on you, to have been called names, to have to flee for your life in several cities, and to be at the twilight and think, here it is again, And I think since then, one of those two men has died. And I think there are people who did quietly heroic things who are just out there. I just feel like we need to find them and someone needs to write it down. And I think I recently lost my great aunt at 108. So I come from a family of centenarians. It's very strange. And when you do that, you think people live forever, right? And the last one died. And I just sort of beat myself up by thinking I had so much time to be able to know what this woman made of her life, starting in one part of this hemisphere and ending up in a very different part of this hemisphere, growing up in rural Jamaica and then sort of being eulogized by a 30-year-old white man, right? That's kind of strange. And I think it's so important that we sort of take that personal obligation because one day there's going to be a Victor who's super smart, or Victor's cousin who's going to be oh my God, I'm so glad it's here. And if it's not there, then who gets to control the narrative? In George Floyd's case, I think remember that when that police report came out, it said he was a man who died of his own accord and some medical incident had taken place, right? Had it not been for the public testimony, the oral history, everything would have been very different.
Yeah, that's great. Let's go to questions then, Marcia.
Now it's...
Thank you so much for a very, very comprehensive talk and for doing that research. I have a two-part question. You talked about history being cyclical, and given that, as I'm saying, young Black men who have families or sons and daughters, we have a tradition in the Black family of the talk. Given where we are now with respect to race relations, what does the talk sound like if you recognize that history is just repeating itself? What would be the talk? What would you say to young women and men, Black women and men? And then also, how do we resist the erasure of Black history in the curriculum in our schools? We know it's happening. Talks like this really, really are important, but how do we make sure that our teachers and our students are getting this information? And it's getting worse. What practices, how can we think outside of the box to make sure that we're incorporating Black history into the curriculum? Thank you.
Okay, I'll give this a little bit of a shot. So I definitely got versions of the talk. It was never exactly a sit-down one talk, but when I was getting my upbringing in Montgomery, Alabama, I was told I needed to be twice as good. But the implication was always that the burden is on you as the individual to get out of the situation, And so I felt like it was very individualized, the talk and the sort of perspective. And I think these days, what's going on in America, community is so vital. And so I think conversations that are more about how we're going to be able to build up together as a community with your family, with your neighbors, I think that would be really, really valuable to me in a way that's different from, I think, a more individualized post-segregation sort of era we're in as Black people. The idea was that, can you be the one who gets out of this situation and elevate yourself? But I think for me, it would have been really beneficial to have a talk more focused on building along with your cousins or your neighbors or other people who are like you going through what you're going through. So,
I've been thinking about this question because I just had a kid. And, I had a girl and I thought, oh man, it's gonna be so great. She's gonna grow up seeing another Black girl just like her as President of the United States, right? And why that happened, why that didn't happen, I think reveals a lot about things you talk about, right? I think it's really easy to sort of essentialize sort of the idea of when do you teach your child the facts of life about America, right? It's important to do, right? I'm not sure I believe with Victor, although he's a lot more qualified than me, that history is necessarily cyclical. I kind of believe we don't really know, right? I think the best that we can do is to do good, teach people to be good, and to rely on community. To me, that's the name of the game. On the erasure question, I think it's a really important one. I think, first of all, big love needs to be given to teachers who are bold and continue to do things, and continue to find ways. And I think also that we have to rely again on our nonprofits, on our community members, on our churches, or in our organizations, in our grocery stores, and our co-ops, seeing as we're in Brooklyn, as places to be able to take up some of the slack from places where we traditionally have it. A teacher at a community college had once approached me and said, I really want to teach your book, but I'm scared. And I asked, well, what else do you teach? And I try to remind her that, this isn't, I didn't think I was creating a DEI or CRT text, right? I thought I was writing a story about the American dream. I thought it was Willie Loman. I thought George Floyd was Jay Gatsby. That's what I thought the story was, right? And I thought it was more important than Willie Loman and Jay Gatsby because neither of those men exist. George Floyd existed, right? And so I think one of the ways that I think we need to train ourselves to speak about these things is to make sure that we don't simply silo the story, that we think about these things as fundamental American stories, right? And then I think we can have a more honest conversation about what's really happening.
And I'll just say, I can't speak to the talk, but I can speak to the cyclical nature. I sometimes look at it as like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. But if you look at American history since, the Civil War, you could describe it as the emancipation, and then Reconstruction, this black empowerment, and then that's the birth of the Klan and the Jim Crow laws. And then time goes by and you look at Brown versus Board, the most significant landmark Supreme Court decision desegregating the public schools. But then at the time, the reaction to that is the birth of the white councils, the bombings that you started to see. You go to the civil rights movement and you see the gains that are made in the 1960s, and then the Southern strategy that sort of separates the states. And then you could go all the way to the election of Barack Obama. And I remember watching these civil rights people describing, like Jesse Jackson saying, I never thought I'd honestly live to see the day where we had a black president. And I remember hearing those words because I was working on this book at the time thinking, okay, what's the reaction going to be to this? Because there's going to be a reaction. And, maybe we're still in one right now. But I prefer to look at it in terms of like the quote of Martin Luther King Jr. when he says, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I just have to think of it that way because otherwise you'll drive yourself crazy that there is going to be a brighter side to come and it's going to be even better. We don't know what that looks like yet, though. I do have hope. Not right now. But yeah. Yeah. And I'll just say in terms of addressing the second part of your question, this is American history. This is who we are as a country. It's not black history. This is American history. And I think we need to understand that and teach this all the time. This is what needs to be taught. You can't cherry pick history about what parts because it might be offensive to white people to hear about this past. Know the past. It'll set you free.
Hi, how are you? I had a question, but I think I know the answer to the question, so I want to invite you to a conversation. The question was going to be, how, if at all, are you integrating or using technology in what you're doing? The fact that the word hasn't come up gives me my answer, so I'd like to invite you to a conversation afterwards to chat, because I'm Ken, I have no publishing company, I have no money, I'm 62, and for the past 30 years, I've been using technology to put Black history on the internet. Well, 97 was the internet, first Black history website. My ed tech system is in 100 schools in 14 states right now. Wow. Okay? We've got over 1,500 videos, including videos for every day of the year. My website, blackfacts.com. Everyone in this room can go visit it right now and check out our Black Fact of the Day video. It's free, so I'm not making any money, but one of my challenges for the past 30 years has been that academics, whatever, have not wanted to talk to me. I do not have an organization. I do not have money. I have 200,000 social media followers and millions of visitors. I do not care what big tech or big government does because I made the tech and I'm using the public internet so they can, I won't say what I was going to say. And that is the power that we have if we use this thing that everybody has in their hands today to teach our stories. So I invite you to a conversation on how we can use technology to make sure that everyone in this room and the 100 countries, 70% have mobile phones. Because we do not need to wonder or ask anyone permission for a long time. We just need to work together. You folks who do the real work, and me who sits on my butt behind a computer. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
Firstly, I want to say thank you again for both your time and wisdom. My question is, obviously Black people are not a monolith, but when we get the stage or, take the stage to finally have a voice for our community, I often feel like I have some ideal that we want to represent, like someone who was perfect in every way that embodies like the best characteristics of Black people. And I'm curious, have you ever dealt with that, like a struggle and balance between telling like the quote best version of the Black story versus, the imperfect victim or the imperfect just human being? And then secondly, how have you personally dealt with that when telling your narrative?
The answer is honesty, right? And research. So the most common question that we got from people who are skeptical about the work was, well, are you going to talk about how George Floyd held a pregnant woman hostage? And the answer is, well, yeah, right? Because that's a part of his life. Also, she wasn't pregnant. Also, she doesn't know it was him. Also, she did not think he held her hostage, right? That's what the research showed, right? So and how do we know that? How do we know that? We went and we interviewed the woman, right? Because that's what responsible journalism is. It's not looking up something and then disambiguating it and playing a game of telephone. That's not what we do. That's not what I specialize in, right? So I heard George Floyd was this. Yes. Did we look at his arrest record? Of course we did, right? But that's not all you do, right? You look up the record of the cop, right, who arrested him, and you look at his pattern of behavior. You see whether he thought he was treated fairly. You speak to his friends around that community, and you talk to them about what he told them about the situation, right? I don't believe necessarily that we have to present perfect people for people to gain empathy for them. That's a burden that's only given to people of color in this country. White people can be ennobled for doing whatever they want if they die in a way that is tragic. And I wish we could all get such treatment, but even more than that, I wish we could all have honest conversations about who people are. I used to tell people, no one marched for George Floyd because they thought he was a perfect man, because nobody's perfect. And then when people discovered he was imperfect, you can tell I had the coffee, when people discovered he was imperfect, all of a sudden there was an issue. They marched because he was a man, right? And I feel similarly about kind of my journey as a reporter. Fortunately, I lived most of my life as a straight edge. The skeletons in my closet are all recent. And but I think the point being that the work has to speak for itself. And the only way you can do that is with honesty and with proper context, right? Because if you don't do that, you're actually doing a disservice both to the person and the society. You're perpetuating an idea rather than helping to dismantle it.
Great. Over there.
Hello. I had a question more about kind of learning a little bit more about your your research process. Specifically, kind of to give context, is that I recently graduated my degree in archival management, and thank you. And a coursework or reading that really kind of showed up and kind of always keeps popping up in my head a lot whenever I'm going through archival work is this article called Archiving While Black, and it talks about Black people's relationships with archival repositories, going from aesthetics of how it is built to how the staff engages with Black researchers, to the care and preservation of materials that focus on Black people, Black communities. And so to all three of you really is how was your experience being in if I'm assuming that you guys were working in archival repositories, how was your experiences being within those spaces? And then what was it like to kind of be in the same space as these historical materials that were centuries old and depending on kind of their own preservation and condition? How was that for you?
Thank you for the question. I think one big dynamic, which I think the journalist definitely knows, and the historian, I think I had the skills as a journalist and I use it as a historian, is you have to be able to, let's say, like work your sources a little bit, you know, in terms of the people who are at the courthouse or the urban renewal office or that kind of thing. So, for example, I really wanted to get access to these lawsuits that were filed for the race massacre in the 1920s. And I felt like, well, if they're lawsuits, they're probably in the courthouse somewhere. But in Tulsa, they were not organized in any kind of coherent way, except through this one clerk named Kitsy. And so I like met Kitsy, and I basically like tried to befriend her, you know, and sort of like, you know, just like I went there a couple of times, started getting a couple lessons first about how to work everything. And then I asked her if she would be willing to, you know, sort of retrieve all these lawsuits for me, you know, which is more work for her because I'm not an attorney paying any fees or anything like that. And ultimately, Kitsy was able to get them on, put them on a CD-ROM for me. I had to find a CD-ROM reader to read these lawsuits, you know. But I think it was part of this building a relationship with this one person. I think the other experience I had that was really valuable and a little bit different was a portion of my book is also about urban renewal in Greenwood and how the interstate destroyed the neighborhood and policies such as that. And there's an urban renewal office in Tulsa that's pretty like it's rarely visited, I guess. And myself and another black researcher who was a graduate student, she had already really developed a relationship with the woman who worked there. So not the person in charge, but the person like at that one office. And so they let us go back there. So we went into the warehouse with all the documents. There's literally a sign that said "Do not enter," but we got to go in there. And so we got to take whatever photos. I was just like scanning things like mad because actually they were planning to destroy every document in that room later that summer. And so I scanned all these documents that have now been shredded, and I was able to incorporate some of the history into my work. And so I think it's a lot of times it's about identifying who is the person, not the lawyer you're going to email, because they're going to say no. Who is the person who actually works in this space that's going to identify what you're trying to accomplish and help you? They could be black or white, but there's going to be people on the ground who will help you, and they're never going to be the person you're supposed to email, because that person is not going to help you 9 times out of 10, in my experience.
Yeah, I'll just add, in my experience, one of the things I was trying to do when I was telling the story of this Groveland case was that I had all the FBI records, I had everything, police reports and everything, but what I didn't have was the defense files, and they were from the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, and they were stored down at the Library of Congress, but nobody gets to see them because there's attorney-client privilege, and you can't just do a Freedom of Information Act request to the Legal Defense Fund. It doesn't work that way. It's not a government entity. And so I'd started writing emails to the director of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund asking for this naively, knowing that, you know, obviously they don't let anybody see this stuff. But I would just write these letters constantly, almost like every couple months, and just saying, I just need the Groveland files. I'm not asking for anything broad. I know exactly where they're cataloged, and these are the numbers, this is where it is. I can just go in and get them, and they just looked at me like, what, are you nuts? And then finally, they relented, and they gave me the files. And I later asked the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund at the time, why did you give them to me? And he goes, oh, it was a headache. Because once we gave them to you, everybody's like, why'd you give them to Gilbert King? He's not even a real academic, you know, why did he get them? And it caused a lot of problems. But he said something that sort of guided my process ever since then. He said, you were just politely persistent. And I just sort of overused that, just be in it for the long haul. And it just sort of softened him up, and he said, all right, I think it's going to help him. And those records allowed me to sort of be a fly on the wall with Thurgood Marshall and his defense team as they went over this case. But I do remember a moment when they gave me access. I was on an Amtrak down to Washington, D.C. like the next day, because I didn't want them to change their mind. But I also had the thought, I was on the train like, oh, shit. What if I get down there and I find out like one of them confessed to this? And, you know, I'd written 90% of the book at this point. That's how long it took. And I remember starting to have a sweat like, oh, man, maybe I should have not looked into this. But obviously, I had to look into it. And when I went into it, it just made it much more rich, brought out much more detail and much more human. Because a lot of times I've talked to lawyers who say, you know, I see these names on these briefs and these motions, but it's not a human story to me. But when I read your book, these people became living, breathing human beings that I could finally put a face to. And it was just invaluable to my research, those archives.
Yeah, the thing that I would ask, I think these are some incredible tips. Everybody knows a hoarder, and I think this is really important. everybody knows someone who saves every birthday card, every note written, who writes everything down. So I'll tell you a story that's a little bit different. I don't tell this a lot because sometimes it gets me in trouble. But we had heard, there was a lot of worry that we wouldn't be able to channel George Floyd's voice in the text because none of us knew him. But I had heard that George Floyd, he wrote raps, he wrote journals. And so everyone we met, we'd ask, well, do you have anything that he wrote to you? And I heard from someone that there was a closet that had a paper bag with all of these things that George Floyd had written. And I thought to myself, geez, if I ask for this at the wrong time, I'm getting kicked out and this person's not going to talk to me. But they were a kind of superstitious person. And one day I saw a magic 8-ball right next to me. And I picked it up and I started shaking it. And the person asked, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm trying to decide whether I should ask you to open the closet." And shook it. And she goes, "Ooh," the person went, let's see. And I shook it and went like this. And the 8-ball said, "Absolutely." And so they opened, and everything that we needed to know about some of the dicier parts of George Floyd's life, he had written about. It was right there. And so, sometimes you have to go to unusual places, but it's usually that aunt, that sentimental friend who will bail you out when the archives won't help. And if you don't have a sentimental friend in your life, this is your call to be the sentimental friend. It will help.
Yes, thank you.
We have time for one more question.
It's going to be a fight.
Hi. Wow. Thank you so much. These talks are incredible and you're amazing. You mentioned earlier shared histories, and as you can probably hear, I was born in a place a little far away, but equally as politically horrible. And I was born in the UK of Caribbean descent, and in the UK, we don't learn about Britain's role in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans unless your school elects to do so, which most schools don't. Every time I'm here, I think it's sort of incredible, the wealth of intention that people put into sharing the stories that exist here. But I guess I have a question about shared histories as the diaspora and what that looks like in the future and now. I mean, these stories are obviously important, but how far back do we go, and what are the conversations that we can be having instead of continuing to have these diaspora wars on TikTok and whatever. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll start. I think history is history and it's interesting, right? And I think, I mean, my family is also from the Caribbean, and it wasn't until I started describing some of the things that happened to George Floyd's family in North Carolina that my dad was like, "Oh, actually that happened to your great-grand," just casually. And I think sometimes there are these connections that are there that we don't necessarily realize that are there. I think, the African American experience, I think, is kind of fundamentally different from a person who moved to another part, who was moved or forced to move to another part of the world. Especially different when they're third place, when they move from Caribbean place to another setting, right? It complicates that sort of tidiness of history. And it also allows the distance to happen of, oh, well, my parents are from Bermuda, so we didn't have to deal with this. And maybe that's true, but also maybe not. And I think the more that we could do to just sort of like not silo history and think about it as a universal story that helps us foster humanity for all, we're just better off. Because, I mean, I think I read somewhere now like 20% of people in New York have Caribbean ancestry, which is wild to me, right? But that also means whatever was carried to New York is New York history. And that also means whatever was there before remains there, right? So like, it's really about being able to see those connections and not be afraid of them.
I think the only thing I would really add is, I think as American-born historians, one thing that we can do is foreground the globalist perspectives of a lot of these very prominent Black figures. W.B. Du Bois, for example, became a globalist over the course of his life and his philosophy, but I don't think the average person would necessarily know that, you know? And so I think maybe there's more that we could do to sort of take these figures that people already are familiar with and say, maybe you didn't know this aspect of what he was doing, but actually he became somebody very much who became a supporter of the idea that the Black diaspora has to work together to overcome racism instead of just only being fixated on what's going on in the United States. So I think that's something that I find interesting to learn about in my research because Du Bois was something I touched on in my book. And so I think maybe trying to foreground how people like Du Bois or King sort of had that globalist perspective. Because oftentimes when we talk about those people in an American context, it's very much Black Americans from slavery and white Americans. And everything else kind of gets pushed to the side, you know? But in their own times, they dealt with a lot of other dynamics. So I think we can do more to sort of bring in the other dynamics into the narratives about these people that folks are already familiar with a little bit.
Have you seen Sinners? I know we have to go. But like, I thought, you know, one of the great turns was, you know, having the Asian American experience within that community, which opened up this like really important conversation about Asian American contributions to Black communities in the South, which is a thing that if you're not from there, you don't know. And I think like, look at what that did just by simply having characters in a film, you know?
Well, thank you, Robert and Victor, for your courage in uncovering stories that many would rather forget, not because they are easy, but because they are necessary. Your work is not just about recovering the past, it's about reclaiming dignity for those whose histories were suppressed. As we conclude, I hope the conversation today reminds us that erasure is not inevitable. It can be resisted by every archivist, every teacher, every storyteller, every listener. And we don't just inherit history, we choose what to remember and what to pass on. So let us honor this moment by committing ourselves to tell what's been hidden, uplift what's been silenced, and insist that all voices, even the uncomfortable ones, belong in our shared history. Thank you all for being part of this work and this conversation today. Thank you.